All right, welcome everybody to Workplace Flexibility, Key Steps to Attracting and Retaining Top Talent in 2022. This meeting will be recorded, so anybody that attends will receive a recording, as well as we will be offering SHRM credits to all attendees, so you receive that code afterwards. Please hold questions in the chat feature, and then we'll ensure that we'll try to get to everybody. So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague, Lisa Vasallo, People and Culture Generalist from Sentinel Benefits and Financial Group, and she'll get us started today.
Thanks, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Nick mentioned, my name's Lisa. I work on the People and Culture team here at Sentinel. I'm really looking forward to this topic today, to learning more. We, like many of you on this call, I'm sure, are constantly looking for ways to adapt and create a flexible environment that's both attractive to potential employees as well as beneficial to our current employees. So I'm really looking forward to some takeaways from today. I am thrilled to introduce today's presenter, Gloria Sinclair Miller. Gloria brings over 20 years of global and domestic HR experience in a variety of industries. She currently serves as the Divisional Director for the Western region of the Society for Human Resources Management, or SHRM. In this role, she's part of the Marketing and Memberships team, which oversees the fostering and promotion of memberships, educational programs, certification, and other services focused on advancing the profession of human resources and creating better workplaces for all. Gloria holds a Master of Science in Human Resources Management and Services, as well as a Bachelor's in Human Resources Management. She also holds the SHRM Senior Certified Professional designation. So take it away, Gloria.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Nick, as well. I am super excited to be able to share some time with all of you this afternoon or morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. So again, my name is Gloria, and I am super passionate about the topic that we're about to go through, which is around workplace flexibility and the key steps to attracting and retaining top talent. So as I share my screen, I would say we're all in a very interesting time. The world has changed significantly over the last couple of years, and our lives have changed personally. Our work lives have changed. And as we are accountable for the people in our organizations, their lives have changed significantly. So when we're thinking about this topic around attracting and retaining talent, it's really about, so what's different? What did we learn from the last 2 years where we had to hurry up and do some things that maybe we hadn't planned to do for a couple of years from now? We had to change how we thought about flexibility in our workplaces, how we worked, where we worked. And for those who were able to work remotely, you had your own set of new experiences and challenges. And for those employers who weren't able to go 100% remote, those challenges were significant as well. So when we look at what has changed, how we work, fast forward 2 years now, we have a variety of different scenarios that may not have existed a couple of years ago. You're having conversations that you may not have had a couple of years ago. And let's put on top of that, we have the employees that are retained and are continuing to be engaged, even with everything else going on. You're also facing what we've deemed the Great Resignation. And through this Great Resignation period, we're seeing a lot of trends. Some of those trends are really impacting every aspect of how we work, because that wall went down over the last 2 years. That wall where I drive to the office, so that's where I disconnect from home and work. And on my drive back, I disconnect from home and work. Well, all of that was all together. Home was at work and work was at home. So as we move forward, some of that hasn't changed. Some of us has learned great lessons from this time, and others maybe a little bit further behind and not ready to adapt to what will now be known as our new normal. So during our time together, I'm going to share some stats. I'm going to share some stories. I'm going to share just hopefully some tools and tricks that you can think about as you think about flexibility as it relates to acquisition and retention of employees. Because at the end of the day, we're accountable for the workplace. It's the people pieces, but it's also, we've got to run our business, and we also have to be aware of the culture that we are creating within our businesses. So like I mentioned, as we go through this, what I always share with individuals is, again, you're going to hear a number of things. You have the chat, so feel free to make comments in the chat or ask questions in the chat. I will hold time at the end for you to ask any questions or address any questions. But the other piece here is write down one or two things that you want to make sure that you either investigate further or that you continue to evolve as you think about this topic around workplace flexibility and how it relates to engaging and retaining your talent. And what we're going to really focus on today is around rethinking flexibility, where people are, how they do their best work, how you remain competitive in the job market, given all the change that's happening, really driving the success, and more importantly, building the business case. Because if you're at a point where you want to make change, it's important that you build the right business case to put the right practices, policies in place. So as I started with this, there's challenges everywhere. We're facing the talent acquisition retention challenges, which is where we're going to focus most of our time. But I would suspect the other three of these are just as important in your workplaces right now. We're talking about compensation and specifically equity, pay equity among our groups. We're talking about workforce safety and health. While we hope we have emerged from the worst of the pandemic, and as people are returning to offices, we're still faced with safety and health issues. And it's not just COVID. There are other things that were impacting the workplace before COVID. We were talking about workplace violence. We were talking about making sure that people's well-being was in a good place. We're talking more now about people's mental health. And then there's this flexibility piece and leave, which again has always been a part of the conversation, but you're also seeing this merge of the acquisition retention conversation with the flexibility and leave conversation. So from a SHRM perspective, we survey our members and sometimes our non-members to find out what are the key challenges that you're facing. So hopefully there's no surprise on this chart when you see that maintaining engagement and morale is the number one thing that employers are dealing with right now. The second one, again, goes back to that health and safety. It's how do I make sure our workplaces are safe? Finding talent, recruiting talent, retaining talent. And then in some cases, it's this hybrid, partially remote, maybe fully back in the office question, and then execution of goes back to the flexibility piece. I'll add a couple of more stats here from a recent SHRM study that we did. It was our state of the workplace that we publish in January of every year. If you asked HR employees or HR members of HR departments, what are the most significant challenges? Where do I need to focus? We got one set. of answers. If you asked US employees, where's the focus? Where should we be focused on as employers? While some of the answers were the same, how US workers translated and prioritized what was important versus HR professionals, departments, was very different. So HR professionals went with, I need to create a sort of work environment. So goes back to number 2, around the 58%. I need to maintain employee morale. Got it. Clear. I need to facilitate an effective process around equity and performance, et cetera. That was number 3. If you asked US workers where they were in that priority of, what do we need to focus on? What should we be focused on? Their top 3 was around attracting the right people into the organization, the engagement piece, so talking about employee morale and engagement, and number 3 was around retaining top talent. So again, our workers recognize how critically important the people piece is for us to make sure right now that we have the right processes, the right practices in place to make sure that we're engaging and we're acquiring and retaining the right people. But there was a little bit of a disconnect on where HR was focused. Now, doesn't mean that was wrong. It means that what our employees were seeing and feeling and experiencing is a little bit different than where our HR teams are. So why do I bring that up? Well, one, I bring it up because it reinforces how important this talent conversation is, because it's what our employees are looking at. It is what they are focused on. And it is why we've seen so many individuals leave roles, move on to different roles, think about whether or not they were going to stay with their current employer who may not have offered flexibility in their situation, whether that's remote work, whether that's hybrid, whatever that is. We saw 31% of employees quit, no job, right? That's a third of our workplace that was leaving, was like, I'm leaving because right now the employer is not focused on where I need to focus. I may need more flexibility. I may need, a hybrid situation. I may need a more inclusive culture, a more sense of belongingness. And 1/3 of the population has said, those who decided to move on in this great resignation period, I'm going to quit and there may not be an opportunity out there. 49% have said, I'm searching for a job, haven't quit yet, but I'm looking and I am honed in on what my employer is doing to ensure that they are focused on my morale, my engagement, and retaining me. But my eye is still open and I'm still looking at what's next. So I share that and then I ask the question, so what is driving this evolution of workplace flexibility? And honestly, we talked about it. It's the change. It's the change that we as a country, as a world, have gone through over the last 2 years, where we've seen the need to focus on self, health, family has gone primary to almost every other thing. It's a sea of change that has happened. The second piece that's driving this is because of said change, technology has supported our needs, both personally and in business. So from a personal perspective, how many of you have done a Zoom happy hour, you've done a Zoom baby shower, you've done a Zoom wedding, maybe. You've done birthday parties, you've done memorial services because of the technology connection. And whether it was Zooms, Teams, Google Hangout, you name your tool, technology has kept us connected personally. And it's done the same thing at work. Personally, I have seen more of my work colleagues through these last 2 years than I would have normally seen if we were in our normal spaces of I'm a remote employee and I'm, versus headquarters employees. I've seen more of them that I would not have seen had we been living how we were in 2019. And the demographics have changed. Some organizations have said, we don't care where you live as long as you get the work done. So during the pandemic, many people moved. They decided, I'm gonna go to a warmer climate because my employer said I can live anywhere. So I don't like snow. I don't like ice. I'm gonna live somewhere warm. I'm one of those. Or I wanna live closer to family because the thought of not being able to see family because of whatever reason, that didn't feel good to me during the pandemic. So I'm going to move closer. So the demographics, the geography, has significantly changed. What our 5 generations in the workplace are telling us is each one feels very differently about how they approach flexibility, how much flexibility they want, what is important. So the demographic change has definitely driven what you may ask for when you're looking at a job or even in your current job situation. So again, these are more statistics to go through, but what does teleworking look like, remote work look like post-pandemic? Well, 68% have said they're probably going to adapt more broader policies, and 50% of our workers cite, hey, it's a desirable factor that they look at. The new realities of our work situation, again, it dives into what our applicants are asking for. These are some of the questions. Those of you who are focused in talent acquisition and hiring managers may have heard some of these. But the new realities and work considerations is as someone is looking at or looking to stay, an internal looking to stay, they want to know about flexibility. They want to have a better handle on the volatility of our environment. So that goes back to, I need to have some flexibility if something changes. They're also concerned about the social impact on the workplace. And this ties into many of the things that happened in the midst of the pandemic, where we had lots of conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So they're focused on what that impact has on them and the employer. Finance has become an issue. Incentives have become an issue, which drives back to that flexibility. For those of you who have young children, childcare is super expensive right now. And if you're still in a situation where your schools are in a hybrid scenario and you're having to manage childcare, some other type care during this period, those incentives that employers should start and have started to consider are important. And then I talked about the geographic considerations. Why do I have to live in a certain state or near an office if the work is now being done remotely? And long-term, there's other changes which drive this flexibility conversation. So again, we've talked about remote work, but we can also talk about what it's doing to our workplaces as it relates to the footprint. Some of you are going into office hybrid, a couple of days a week, whatever that is, but do we need as many office spaces? Could we reinvest that money somewhere else? That goes back to those new considerations. How do I help my employees be more successful if I could decrease the amount of an office footprint. I get rid of some rent somewhere. I consolidate some pieces. And what we're seeing come out of that in this reframing of the work dynamic is companies being a little bit more open to not only the remote work, but the childcare support. The other piece is we've decreased business travel significantly. I used to travel 60% of the time. I don't travel 60% of the time. I do a little bit more of this than I've done, in years past. So what impact does that have on my life, on my employer? Does that create more flexibility that I'm not on an airplane 4 days out of every week? So thinking through this reframed work dynamic and what that does, not only for the retention pieces, but also as you engage. So the post-pandemic talent crisis, if you would, another way of saying great resignation, is really around how do you get your arms around what is happening so that you can make sure that your organization is in a good place on the other side of this. So here's the thing that I tell people all the time when we're having these talent conversations is we had a skills gap talent shortage prior to March 2020. I was having this conversation with individuals and groups prior to 2020. We were talking about identifying transferable skills, upskilling, reskilling, finding talent. How do we source in-house talent? How do we build a pipeline for the future? So guess what? Those are still the questions that we need to be asking in this post-pandemic talent crisis. The other piece we have to keep in mind is when you're looking at your talent acquisition and your management life cycle, what's changed? How has it evolved going into this now 2022? How do we look at the market differently? How are we engaging? How are we sourcing? What are we looking for? Are we so focused that someone needs to live in XYZ city and be within a commutable distance to an office? Or are we thinking more broadly about what that sourcing strategy looks like? And it's not all about relocation. It's about, can someone do a job from a different place? It's also looking at untapped talent groups as part of your sourcing strategy and being able to create some flexibility with those groups. So that ties back to, what does your candidate look like? Does the candidate profile look differently? And being able to look at that candidate profile, you have to tie in the business piece, because again, we're HR leaders, we're business leaders. Did your customer profile change during the course of our time that we spent over the last 2 years? And if it didn't change, I would be surprised. But if we just think about the service industry and how much we now do pickups and delivery and things that typically we would take the time to walk into a physical retail establishment to do, or a physical service to do. And now we're no touch. I want to go in, I want to get it, or I want it delivered to my house, or I want to pull into a parking lot and I want to pick it up, or I want, XYZ, DoorDash, Grubhub, whoever to come to my house. So our profile has changed, which leads back to, do we still have the right candidate profile? And then based on that, do we have the right sourcing strategies in place? So does my sourcing change based on the profile and the candidate that I'm looking for? And again, it's this evolution that we're now seeing as we go through this. And then again, like we have before, it's really focusing on what are the skills and competencies needed for the current workforce. And oh, by the way, the future workforce as well, because you should always be hiring not only for that role, but the role the person possibly could be in 2 roles from now. And then there's the relationship building. Not only the relationship that you have maybe with groups that you work with potentially, but your relationship with the candidates. So there's so much conversation about ghosting, whether the company ghosted or the candidate ghosted. So from an employer perspective, we have an opportunity to make sure we're building a strong relationship, whether with the candidate we're talking to today for a position or the candidate we're talking to today for a position of the future, building out that talent pipeline. Because again, we still have a skills gap. Even with all the movement and change that has happened, there's still some opportunities. I hit on this really briefly when I talked about we have untapped talent groups that we need to be thinking about. So just so we're all clear, when I talk about untapped talent groups, what I'm talking about are groups that we traditionally may not have tapped into. So the ones that we focus on when we think about the talent pool is, I want to get the passive, or maybe someone who is actively looking for a new career changers. I may target the underemployed. I may target the overemployed in some cases, because maybe I need a more mature worker in my workplace, or someone who's got more expertise and skill for a particular role to take the role to the next level. You've got those who are displaced. You've got our graduates, our new students who had a really tough time over the last 2 years coming out of an undergraduate situation and then going into employment. Many of them went back to school during this time. And then you have these untapped talent groups. So our SHRM definition, as we talk about untapped talent, which is probably very similar to how many of you talk about it, is we're talking about veterans and military spouses. We're talking about hiring the formerly incarcerated. We're talking about hiring individuals who may have disabilities. We're talking about hiring opportunity youth. So those individuals who are between the ages of 18 to 24, who may not have graduated from high school and gone on to a college or university. Maybe some of them have gone on and received a GED later. If you combined all of those untapped talent groups together, it could almost fill all of the open jobs that we have today. Now, why do some people not tap into those groups? Well, one of it that we've seen definitely over the last couple of years as we've been having this conversation is there's a lot of unconscious bias. So before anyone gets defensive that I've said someone has a bias potentially, let's be clear. We all have unconscious biases. If we didn't have one, we wouldn't be breathing. We all have this bias, this learned stereotype that happens automatically. However, it's unintentional. It may be based on where we were raised, how we were educated, etc., but we all have it. The key is overcoming it and recognizing it first, and then overcoming where is that bias coming from, and not letting that bias deter you from looking at a certain group. And those groups aren't just the untapped talent group. Keep in mind, older workers are a group that still, as we talk about the 5, soon to be 6 generations in the workforce, the older workers find that sometimes they're tapped into this stereotype of, well, they're not going to want to do a certain job, or they're not going to be physically active, etc. So we have to keep in mind when we're talking about hiring, retaining, engaging, and thinking about flexibility, that we can't let our biases in some of these groups prevent us from having a conversation. You might have a bias against someone who's coming out of the military or a military spouse. That bias might be, they're not going to be able to work full time. They're going to move around too much. They're not, they may not have had an education, veteran, may not have had the education that a traditional, and I'm using quotations there, candidate who came through a college and university would have. And all of that is bias. All of that are things that you think may be true, but you have to dive into a little more. And some of that ties into the flexibility conversation and our thought process. The other reason why, from a flexibility, I may not hire one of these groups might be because there's a perception that they all will not be able to commit the time. So I say all that to say, making sure that as we're thinking about flexibility, we're also thinking about and making sure that we don't let our biases get in the way. The other piece that's critically important when we're thinking about our flexibility in the workplace is also having a moment and pause and think about empathy. So why am I talking about empathy in the workplace? Well, let's be clear, and HR people included. Again, we've had a really tough 2 years. If you were in a role or supporting a role, our frontline workers who were, there day in and day out, our HR professionals became frontline workers as well through the pandemic, having to deal with all kinds of legislation changes, rules, policies, et cetera. So this ability, as we've had to plow through and think about how we get creative with our employees to help them be more productive, goes back to how are we being a more empathetic workplace? How are we making sure that our employees are healthy? And it's not just the physical health that you can see, it's the mental health pieces as well. How are we making sure that they're healthy? And if we're making sure they're healthy, making sure that they're engaged, and oh, by the way, they would be less likely to leave. And some of that comes from communication. So this is data points that come from our effective workplace index that we use. And some of these are not a surprise. The more supportive culture that comes from coworkers, the supervisor support, the satisfaction with wages and benefits, all of that is important. But what I would say to you is the three at the top, work-life fit, coworker support, supervisor support, are at the top for a reason. And it's the simple things that help an employee feel like the organization cares. And when we've been in situations where we've been connected by technology, it's amazing, especially when we look at the research, how many employees felt more connected in a remote environment, that there was a higher sense of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and empathy in a remote situation than there was in an in-person situation. So think about it. We thought, and I use the collective we, that the only way an employee is going to feel engaged and connected, et cetera, is because they're in the office, they're having the chats at the water cooler between, meetings. But the reality is that was not helping them feel engaged. What was helping them feel engaged was because we were locked in houses in some cases and not able to travel or go, and your work was this all the time, we felt more connected. We saw cats and dogs run across keyboard screens. We saw children run in the background. We heard birds chirping in the background, like all of that. We felt people's total lives coming into work, which helped them feel more connected and helped with the empathetic workplace. And then the last thing is, again, stats that you've probably seen about burnout. Like, we've seen people burn out. So if we want to turn the corner, turning the corner comes from what are we doing to continue to make people feel connected? So I gave you a lot of stats. I gave you a lot of information. So what can you do now? Why do we want to focus on this as it relates to acquisition and retention of your employees? Well, one, we all know that someone leaves, the cost to replace an employee is going to be 1.5 times more than if we were just able to develop someone internally. So when someone leaves, there's that productivity drop because there may or may not have been someone to pick up that person's responsibility when they left, or you didn't have the ready to go. So the flexibility piece with our workforce, whether they're coming in or they're already here, helps us to reduce productivity. Obviously, from a business perspective, there's the business continuity piece. It makes high-skilled labor more affordable. So if you're constantly willing to invest in your employees, then you won't have to keep paying more for other employees to replace those employees. And then it also provides access, from a flexibility perspective. This goes back to our untapped talent conversation, to a more diverse group of workers, because outside of getting the right people in the right seat and keeping those individuals, we're also struggling in some cases to still make sure that our workplaces are not only diverse, but they're inclusive as well. So we've talked about how the work has changed. And I'd be curious for you to think about and ponder as we go through the rest of these slides, like how can flexibility and agility make your business work better in the future? And some of you may be doing things today that you weren't doing 2 years ago, but some of you may be on the cusp of, what do I need to do? What is it? What is the 1 or 2 things that I need to do to make sure that we're going to strive and thrive as it relates to our talent and flexibility in the future? So the key thing as you're thinking through this is figuring out where you're going to invest. Where am I going to invest, and how am I going to retain that talent? What is going to be the investment piece? And being very clear about what that is. We all do it. We make a laundry list of all the things that we want to do. And the reality is business is still happening. There's got to be 1 or 2 things that I'm going to invest in to make sure that I'm able to attract and or retain my top talent, or just my talent in general. Part of this process needs to come through assessing the culture. So if you're looking to drive more empathy and flexibility into your organization, it's also important to make sure the culture is ready for that. You can't start having an agility being a conversation about being more agile if you've not teed that up in the organization, if that has not been part of the organizational culture. So what is the culture? Because your priority may be, we really have to look at the culture that exists today before we can even think about attracting or even retaining our talent. We're going to have to assess and really understand the culture we have and the culture we want. During that time, it's also going to be about, if your organization doesn't do this already, practicing empathy and flexibility. So what are the pieces? Where have we maybe been so by the book that it has prevented us from growing talent? It has prevented us from acquiring new talent where we needed to. Are we so inflexible about when someone needs to be in an office, or when or what positions are remote versus what positions are not remote? Or even when you're looking at untapped talent groups, Let's say it's hiring someone who's been formerly incarcerated. If the policy is saying we're not hiring anyone who's ever had, including a misdemeanor, anyone, is that job specific, or is that the company? Like, what, understanding what that is, and are there roles where someone could join the organization? Recognizing some employers, it's a huge, like defense companies, banks, like some of those are institutional and will take a long time to make changes. And some of them, there may not be the business case to change, but other employers, there's a little bit more flexibility around the no versus let's talk about what roles there are. Same holds true for any of the other groups that I identified as well. Some of you, from an employer perspective, it might be a safety investment that's needed. Maybe I'm losing people because of something as it relates to safety, and it doesn't have to be all COVID related. It's not COVID all day, all night. There are other pieces that may be impacting the safety. And if you put safety with health/mental health, there may be something in the culture. There may not be an avenue for employers or employees to go to if they need. So most employers have an EAP, every employer doesn't. So what are those things to invest in? I would call it health and safety. The other piece to this is you may be doing all of these things right, but from a brand perspective, I have no idea. You may have the best flexibility policy. You may have the best culture. You may already be practicing empathy, but it's not promoted in your brand anywhere. So if I'm an employer looking for an opportunity, I may not have even thought about XYZ employer or XYZ industry because it's not promoted. And these days, as people, going back to that 31% who quit with no job, these are some of the things that they're honed in on when they're looking at company website, company posting, et cetera. What is that you need to invest in to promote this brand around flexibility, culture, empathy? And then you need to get feedback. And it's not just from me. It could be from others. It can be, quite frankly, from your own employees. So don't always spend time being externally focused and not looking internally at what your employees are saying. What are some of the things that are important to them that would make an easy change to not only retain them, but also to attract them? So it goes without saying, and the rest of these are pretty, and we can share, I think we're going to share these slides. The rest of these are just quick reminders around what you need to make sure you're doing as it relates to building out your priorities and your plan. So making sure that obviously whatever you do around flexibility, if we're talking about talent, it aligns to some current initiatives that are out there. There's definitely research out there about flexibility, flexible work strategies, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and making sure that you lean on some of those pieces. Don't recreate the wheel when it's time to build your case around why there needs to be more flexibility. The most important step is communication. So it goes back to, we could do all of these things and we never talk about it. And how important communication is. So if we look at it from an internal perspective, going back to, employees who do really well in empathy and making people feel like they belong, it's because of those social connections that they've been able to create. It's because they've been able to use their technology, and they're doing wellness checks. So that could be just a quick, hey, let's hop on the call. Let's hop on the phone. Let's do whatever we need to check in to make sure that you're okay. That every time your manager calls, it's not just because they need something. It's because they truly care about the person and they want to make sure that whatever the arrangement is, it's working, or to find out if there's something that they need. And flexibility isn't always about remote work. Flexibility could be about, I want to come in and work core hours. And maybe that's something for a whole group. Maybe that's for an individual, but if you are going to require people to come back into the office, or even those who are remote with the ones that are in the office, can you work core hours? Can there be 10 to 2 that everyone is expected to be working? But there may be some that work 10 to 6 or 7. There may be some that work 5 a.m. to 2, whatever that is, but making sure that you're only going to know that by communicating with employees, better understanding what their needs are. Everyone immediately thinks it's remote work. Everyone wants remote work. It's not always that. There are a lot of people out there, some of you included, who may work better in an office than you do at home. So it's really thinking through and defining what flexibility is, communicating what that means, and communicating it as part of your brand, but also thinking about it as a retention strategy. And once you get all those pieces together, it's making sure that it's really embedded in how you onboard, how you continue to engage, and how you retain. And again, there's just a couple of more things about thinking about flexibility options. Like I said, some of it is reducing time off, and really having people have choices about how they manage their time. And when you're ready to test drive and try something different, it starts with drafting a policy or a practice, seeking some input, getting some samples of how it's going to work. And my advice, and many of you have gone through this with implementation, test and learn first. Try it out with a group, start with a pilot, get the best practices, learn from that, determine what change management will need to be implemented so that it is a smooth rollout on whatever you decide, if you decide to change something. And if you're in a position where maybe you don't need to change something, you just need to enhance and communicate better, then again, start with a pilot of how would we communicate this in a different way so that our employees are aware that this is something we offer. This is part of our culture. This is part of our brand. So it's super important that you make those decisions on how you want to communicate. And I'm going to hit the communication piece probably over and over because it's so critically important and where we often break down in this. So again, if you're going to do something around WorkFlex, being clear, training people, especially your people managers, because this may be something new for your people managers. You want to track, you want to be able to record, why this worked or didn't work. And if you need to update in some way. And my favorite word, communicate. And you want to continually solicit feedback so that you can evaluate and continue to make things better. And again, this is with any program you do, not just the ones we're talking about as it relates to flexibility and your talent and retention programs. But you need to really continue to get that feedback, continue to make sure your employees feel like if they share feedback that you heard them. Doesn't mean you have to actually execute everything that you hear, but acknowledgement that you've heard them, and the piece about evaluate and reevaluate. Because as we all know, our workplaces are becoming more diverse than ever. It's changing and continues to change every day, which makes it super exciting for all of us who are in this space. So our goal is to create a better workplace and a better world for our employees. So I hope during our time together, again, I've shared nuggets and pieces that we've heard from our members around what you can do to help to ensure that your organizations are really thinking ahead as it relates to flexibility and really thinking about groups that you haven't tapped into and starting to consider different things that you want to do. And more importantly, the why and why this is so important to do it right now. So I'm hoping that as we wrap up, and I'll pause and see if there's any questions, that you've been able to take a couple of takeaways, again, not the laundry list, but a couple of takeaways of something that you want to investigate further, that you may do differently or approach differently or ask differently as you think about what you can do to promote flexibility, whether it's in your current organization with your current talent for retention and in attracting talent. So with that, I'll put up my contact information. I'll pause and see if there are any questions or comments that I can answer at this point. And
Thanks so much, Gloria. We did get a couple of questions just about if the recording and slides are going to be sent out. The answer is yes, they are. We do have one question, if you can see it. What positions are more likely to offer remote work?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I think where you often see positions that are offering remote work, obviously administrative positions where the person doesn't need to physically be in the office. Now, some of those we are still seeing that if the senior leader is still physically going to an office, they tend to want their administrative person to be in the office, at least on some of the days that they're there, depending upon. A lot of IT roles, obviously many roles, finance. So a lot of, I'll say the corporate staff function roles you see. There's some that were already remote. That remain remote, and even the requirement of you need to go into the office 1 day a week, you're seeing less of. So, accounts, management, marketing, sales, those types of roles. But pretty much the roles that you still see that are traditionally not going remote are the ones that have to be in the building, or those services that have to have an in-person, right? So hospital healthcare, our retail, our restaurants, our hospitality. But even in those, you're starting to see them try to adopt more of a hybrid where there's certain days that maybe things can be remote, or you do more of a compressed work week.
That's great. The next question kind of builds on that a little bit, and you touched on this a little bit, which I thought was really fascinating. If someone doesn't have a remote work policy, how could they best still promote workplace flexibility?
No, that's a great question. So the best way to promote it is really just without having a remote work policy, there are things that you're doing that create flexibility. So maybe it's the core hours piece where, people work certain hours that everyone agrees that you're going to work these certain hours and be available. But beyond that, you have some flexibility. The other things that leaders have done is they've looked at roles and said there might be certain roles where we can create flexibility, and maybe you're doing 4-10, so 4 10-hour days, and you have the one off, and that, without creating a work policy, some organizations have been able to do. But the best feedback comes from the employees, because they're going to tell you what they need. And some of that may be minor tweaks that don't require a policy. I need to come in 2 hours later on Tuesdays and Thursdays because I need to do drop off. And those are easy. things. But I would say the best way to do it is ask your employees first. And if you start to see a trend, then you may want to put some policies and practices around what that looks like and guidelines for managers. But some of it is just simple things.
Great. All right. Another one, do you have any resources for developing a more empathetic workplace? We do not have the availability for remote work or much flexibility in scheduling due to the nature of the workplace. So believe concentrating on empathy is best for us.
Great. No, there's definitely and some resources that are out there. And again, you're in a very important environment where your employees need to be there for your constituents, your clients in this case, which is children and adolescents. So yes, if you visit the SHRM site or my contact information is up there, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to direct you to some resources that you can use.
Great. Here's a good one. This is one that I know has come up with us, is kind of maintaining, if you're implementing policies, making sure they're equitable. So one person says, we allowed a secretary to relocate to South Carolina and work 100% remote. How do we ensure that we're making these types of decisions in an equitable manner?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I guess part of it, I would go back to, how that decision was made. If there were guidelines that were put in place about that person's role. So because it sounds like that's a role that can be done 100% remote, and who the decision makers were in that situation. And so my advice would be just making sure, and I'm sure you have documented how that decision was made, because the next time the request comes through, you want to use a similar process to make sure that number one is, can the job be done? What is the job? Can the job be done remotely? What impact does that have on the business? And then the other piece to it is making sure that the manager and the team that this person supports will still be serviced in a way, and the client will still be serviced in a way that it's not going to impact the business. And then the other piece, which is also important, is making sure that the person can do the job remotely. And it's beyond the pieces of, we need to make sure they have the tools and resources, because we hope we would get them that. But have they demonstrated performance that will allow them to be successful in a total 100% remote situation? So asking some of those questions consistently when you get the requests, I think will help ensure that, it's an equitable, and then who makes that decision. And the last one is, you also need to make sure, especially if it's one-offs like these, you're assessing on a consistent basis how that's going. So whether that's quarterly, every 6 months, every year, but you need to make sure that you're checking in and making sure that it still works for the business and team.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions unless someone is typing one as we speak. This was awesome. I personally found some great takeaways I'm definitely going to take back to my team, just because, this is an area that's always changing, and I feel like there's always more ways to improve. So I would like to thank you for sharing all of your insights today.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you.